One of the other topics that I think we want to look at here, which I think is kind of cool when we're talking about this, is in addition to being larger models, there are smarter approaches rather than just working harder, as Ron mentioned, where some of the vendors we heard from at AI Infrastructure Field Day 5 started talking about how to approach some of these scale problems with software rather than just throwing more and more equipment at them. And I was really hoping that we could touch on that a little bit during this time. I mean, a couple of the examples that come to mind were the idea CTERA had of using a file system as kind of a central brokerage point for your AI models. And I was really impressed with the Solidigm and MinIO discussion on essentially using SSDs as a shared memory level among various different SSDs, and the idea of being able to preserve KV state, key value state, so you actually didn't have to reproduce that entire state every time that you wanted to rerun the model. So those are a couple of things where we're not actually throwing more hardware at the problem. We're actually applying smarter software solutions problem, and that's always one of the things that fascinates me.
Yeah, I agree with you, Andy. In fact, when AV talked about it as being a software problem, framed it as that as opposed to a hardware problem for the KV project at AI Infrastructure Field Day 5, I really thought that made a lot of sense for the reasons you just mentioned, as well as CTERA. You mentioned as well that letting the infrastructure do some of the heavy lifting. And frankly, it's not even really heavy lifting. It's just time consuming. If you already have the components that we always talk about placing the data near compute. What happens when you can have the solution where the data lives actually be helpful, right? And I think that's where in that demonstration from CTERA, that's where I felt that came through, as opposed to spending extra cycles and potentially token, right? To kind of tease out the important pieces, the metadata out of the data that it already knows about.
And the MinIO and Solidigm discussion, the other thing I liked about that is it kind of built on concepts that Solidigm and Phison had already planted with us at previous AI infrastructure field days, where they had essentially consumer level models where they were using SSDs as a cache for GPU memory. The MemKV approach that MinIO put forward is actually a little bit more of an enterprise level solution to that same problem. So,
yeah, one of the things that struck me about both the KV cache persistence, as well as what CTERA is doing with pre-generating derived artifacts, both of these are situations where we've got a piece of data that you can recreate at will, but there's a cost to that recreation. And so for CTERA, they're front-loading the cost and saying, we're going to generate it up front so it's a reusable asset that you can later use multiple times at no additional cost, in particular to latency when you want to do something with it. KV cache offload or tearing out, that absolutely it's recreatable data, but again, there's a cost in both time and compute resource in order to recreate it. And so we're just retaining what would otherwise be a transitory asset that you would derive, but we're making it persistent in order to not throw it away. So it's software doing this idea of retaining something that otherwise would be considered just disposable because we can recreate it. But yeah, recreation of data always has a cost.
I love the translation of core computing principles up the stack, right? You have predictive fetching in microprocessors. We have speculative decoding. We do the same thing here. If we think we're going to use it again, decode it once. If we can use it again, that is an incredible savings on bandwidth and GPU. And having a place to overflow KV cache and context into tiers of cache storage. I look at some of the history in the work I've been doing just in my chats and the code work. There can be a project I step away from for a few days or a week, come back to it. It would be nice if it could just refetch those out of KB cache and refresh them rather than having to recreate them all over again. So I can see a space for multiple layers of caching.